The forest holds its breath at dusk. Deep in the sun-drenched canopy, a young chronicler named Elara makes a choice that could exile her forever. She leaves the safety of her people to venture into the forbidden whispering woods, driven by a single burning need. She must document the secret Nightfall rituals of the Shadow Glade clan, a people shrouded in fear and mystery. Her goal is audacious. She wants to prove that understanding, not ancient fear, should guide their two civilizations. By staying until the end, you will witness a profound journey into the heart of cultural fear and the fragile birth of understanding. What truly happens when the shadows themselves begin to dance? And what price is a single truth worth in a world built on lies? What would you risk to learn a hidden truth? Her training was the only thing holding her panic at bay. Elara forced her breathing to slow, matching the rhythm of the faintly pulsing fungi under her feet as she stepped over the unseen border. Her charcoal moved frantically across the page, capturing the alien script that seemed to bleed from the tree bark itself. Then the forest's stillness shattered. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the very air, a sound that seemed to originate from the shadows between the trees. 2 points of sharp, luminous green light ignited in the darkness, unblinking and fixed solely on her. The territorial ward was not a magical sigil or a tripwire, but a living, breathing sentinel. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to abandon her mission, and flee back to the sunlit world she knew. But the sketchbook in her hands felt impossibly heavy, its single completed page a testament to the truth she sought. To run was to be hunted. To stand her ground was a gamble of terrifying proportions. Her choice was made in a single, shaky exhale. She froze, her movements becoming impossibly slow and deliberate. She lowered the sketchbook, holding it out before her, and then gently placing it on the moss-covered ground. It was a universal gesture, she hoped, of surrender, of offering, of having no weapon. The luminous eyes advanced, the shadows around them coalescing into a solid, terrifying form. A wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, emerged from the gloom. Its fur was not merely dark, but seemed to drink the faint light, wreathed in a tangible mist. Its breath plumed in the cool air, a silent cloud that carried the scent of damp earth and ancient power. The silent forest was no longer a place of mystery, but a cage, and she was trapped inside with its keeper. The wolf did not lunge, it circled her, a slow, deliberate orbit of silent power that made the air itself feel thick. Its nose, cold and wet, brushed against her trembling hand, then sniffed at the leather cover of the sketchbook on the ground. Every tale of shadow beasts and their savage fury screamed in her mind, but the creature before her was not a mindless monster. It was assessing. Elara's breath caught in her throat, her movements glacial. She reached a hand into the small pouch at her belt, her fingers closing around a piece of sun-dried golden pear. It was a traveler's ration, but also the traditional offering of a guest seeking safe passage among her own people. She held it out on her open palm, a small, bright token against her skin. The wolf paused, its luminous eyes shifting from her face to the fruit. After a tension-filled moment, it dipped its head and took the morsel with a surprising delicacy, its rough tongue brushing her skin. The low growl ceased, and the aggressive tension in its powerful shoulders seemed to ease by a single, crucial degree. This was not the beast of legend. This was a thinking creature, one that understood a gesture of peace. The fear that was her birthright warred violently with the evidence before her eyes. Could an entire history be wrong? The question was more terrifying than the wolf itself. Her mission was no longer just about recording symbols in a book. It was about confronting the very foundation of her world. She had to know if this fragile truce could become a bridge. Slowly, she pointed a finger to her own chest, and then, with a sweeping gesture, indicated the deep, dark heart of the woods, the direction from which the faint, rhythmic thrum of distant drums seemed to emanate. She was risking everything on a hope, on the chance that this sentinel could understand her intent. The wolf watched her, its head tilted. Then it let out a short, soft chuff, a puff of air that was neither a growl nor a bark. It turned, its dark form melting into the deeper shadows, but it paused and looked back at her. The message was unmistakable. It was leading her. The personal fear for her safety was now inextricably woven with the soaring, terrifying hope of a real discovery. She was not being taken as prey, but being guided as a guest, and that changed everything. The path Umbra chose was one Elara would have sworn did not exist. Beneath a lattice of thorns that looked impenetrable, the wolf would simply pause, and the shadows themselves seemed to part. Where she had seen only chaotic undergrowth, she now recognized subtle patterns, a bent frond here, a specific type of luminous moss marking a turn there. These were not trails, but a network of hidden roads, and her guide was a master of their navigation. Other presences flitted at the edge of her vision, pairs of glowing eyes in the deep gloom that locked onto the intruder. But one low rumble from Umbra's chest sent them melting back into the darkness. She was under a protection she had not asked for and did not fully understand, a safe passage that was as humbling as it was terrifying. Her chronicler's mind was a whirlwind, desperate to capture every detail, to map this impossible journey. She wanted to sketch the way the bioluminescent fungi pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping giant's heartbeat. She longed to record the exact sound of Umbra's chuff, a sound that seemed to communicate complex ideas to the unseen forest. But her fear was a constant counterpoint, a drumbeat of ancestral warning that made her hands tremble and her breath catch at every snapped twig. The two parts of her, the seeker of truth and the daughter of the sunlit canopy, were at war. One screamed that this was a trap, an elaborate lure. The other, the part that had tasted the golden pear and seen intelligence in those luminous eyes, whispered that this was a greater truth than any her people possessed. In that internal conflict, a decision was made. She consciously stilled the frantic scribe within and forced herself to simply walk, to observe, to trust the massive, shadow-wreathed form leading her. It was an act of faith that felt like a betrayal of her entire upbringing, a quiet rebellion against a lifetime of taught fear. Her entire mission, the fate of her hope for understanding, now rested on the whim of this single creature, from the civilization she had been taught to dread. She was utterly dependent, completely vulnerable, and the weight of that realization settled deep in her bones. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as they moved ever deeper, the distant drumbeat growing from a faint thrum to a tangible vibration in the soles of her feet. Then, without warning, Umbra stopped at the edge of a vast clearing. The air here was different, thick and humming, with a low, resonant energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Through the veil of hanging moss and twisted branches, she saw them, the first gathering of dark, graceful figures moving in the center of the open space. The moss was cool and damp against her cheek, as Elara pressed herself low behind the ancient log. One by one, figures emerged from the deep shadows between the trees, their arrival so silent it felt less like movement, and more like the forest itself giving them form. They were tall and lithe, their movements a fluid, synchronized dance of purpose. Their faces were painted with intricate patterns of a deep, matte black that seemed to absorb the faint ambient light, making their features difficult to discern. This was the Shadow Glade clan, not as monsters from a fireside tale, but as a living, breathing people engaged in a sacred rite. Awe washed over her, cold and profound. She was witnessing a moment of profound intimacy, a ritual no Canopy Folk had ever legally seen, and the sheer privilege of it warred violently with a deep-seated, instinctual trepidation. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that felt deafening in the pervasive quiet. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to reject the profound strangeness of the scene. She forced her body to become part of the log, to breathe in shallow, silent sips of air. Her chroniclers focused the only anchor in a sea of primal fear. She had to record this. Her sketchbook was too slow, too clumsy for the fluidity before her. Her hand crept slowly into her pack, fingers searching for the smooth, cool surface of her light-capturing crystal. It was a precious tool, one that could etch a perfect image onto its core, but it was also a terrible risk. A single stray beam of moonlight, catching its facets, would gleam like a beacon, betraying her hiding place in an instant. This was the precipice. One mistake would not just mean her own capture. It would shatter this fragile chance at understanding and confirm every dark prejudice her people held. It would prove their fear was justified, and she would be the one who had forged the final, unbreakable lock on the cage of animosity between their peoples. Holding her breath, she carefully angled the crystal, its face pointed toward the gathering, just as the first low, resonant chant began to rise from the clan's people. The very shadows around them began to writhe, coalescing into solid, living forms that answered their call. A deep, resonant chant began to rise from the assembled figures, a sound that was less a melody and more a fundamental vibration. It did not echo through the clearing, but was absorbed by it, sinking into the soil and the bark of the trees. In response, the shadows themselves began to stir. They peeled away from the trunks and the undergrowth, detaching like living silk to swirl around the participants. This was not a chaotic mess of darkness, but a complex, flowing dance, the shadows weaving between the clan's people in intricate, purposeful patterns. Elara's fear was momentarily drowned out by a wave of pure, unadulterated awe. Her charcoal flew across the page of her sketchbook, her hand a frantic blur as she tried to capture the impossible geometry of the weaving shadows. She was not documenting a worship of darkness. She was witnessing a mastery of it. This was a communal effort, a shared art form where the intangible was being shaped and woven into something new, a protective tapestry made of night itself. The realization was a seismic shift in her understanding, cracking the foundation of every story she had ever been told. Her scientific curiosity, that burning need to chronicle and comprehend, now waged a furious war against a deep, primal terror. The living darkness swirled closer to her hiding spot, a tendril of cool, sentient shadow brushing against the log where she lay. It felt like a breath of absolute zero, a void that was somehow alive. The instinct to curl into a ball, to shut her eyes and pray for it to pass, was overwhelming, but the chronicler in her won. She had to see the source. Gritting her teeth against the tremors in her limbs, she made a choice. She began to edge slowly, painfully slowly, around the side of the massive log, seeking a better vantage point on the central ritualists who seemed to be directing the flow of the shadowy river. Every inch of movement felt like a mile, every rustle of her cloak a scream in the profound silence that underpinned the chant. She was no longer a safe observer hidden at the fringe. She was an intruder, deliberately placing herself within the sacred space. Her presence, a potential poison to the very ritual she sought to understand. The stakes were no longer just about discovery, but about desecration, and then it happened. Her boot, searching for purchase on the damp earth, dislodged a small, loose stone. The clatter was not loud, but in the absorbed silence of the ritual, it sounded like a thunderclap. The resonant chanting ceased as if severed by a blade. In the sudden, profound silence, dozens of pairs of eyes, gleaming with reflected bioluminescence, turned in unison toward the log where Elara hid. Her heart seemed to stop in her chest. A tall, stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, braided like a crown, stepped forward from the circle. Her gaze, sharp and ancient, pierced the gloom and found Elara as if the log offered no cover at all. The shadows themselves seemed to solidify, forming a loose, inescapable ring around her position. She was exposed, her mission compromised in the most catastrophic way possible. Every instinct screamed for flight, a desperate, scrambling run back into the woods, but she knew it was futile. Umbra was gone, and these people moved like the night itself. To run would be to confirm she was a spy, a hostile invader. The choice was not between escape and capture, but between defiance and a plea for mercy. With a trembling breath that felt like her last, Elara made her decision. She rose slowly from behind the log, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She held her hands out, palms open and empty, to show she held no weapon. Then she bowed. It was the full, formal bow of the Canopy Folk, a deep, respectful gesture reserved for elders and honored guests, her forehead nearly touching the cool moss. In that single, vulnerable motion, her personal quest for knowledge vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of a potential inter-tribal incident. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, could ignite the long smoldering hostility between their peoples into an open flame. The air grew thick and heavy as the leader, who the others seemed to defer to with a subtle shift in posture, studied her. The woman's expression was unreadable, carved from cold obsidian. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and resonant, like stone grinding against stone. You carry the sun on your cloak and the scent of fear on your skin. Speak, child of the canopy. Explain why we should not treat you as the trespasser you are. Anya's demand hung in the air, sharp as a blade. You carry the sun on your cloak, she had said, her words a vessel for generations of distrust. The other clansmen shifted, their dark painted faces hardening into a wall of unified suspicion. In that single, charged moment, Elara ceased to be an observer and became a prisoner, her fate entirely in the hands of the very people she had risked everything to understand. Her mind raced, sifting through a dozen lies and half-truths that might save her. She could claim she was lost, that she had stumbled here by accident. But looking into Anya's unyielding eyes, she knew a lie would be her death sentence. It would confirm every prejudice, every story of the deceitful sun child. The only weapon she had was a truth that sounded like madness. She drew a slow, steadying breath, forcing her voice not to tremble. "I am a chronicler," she began, her words clear and deliberate. "I did not come as a spy or as a thief. I came to learn. Among my people, your rituals are spoken of only in whispers, as things of terror. I believed that if I could see them for myself, if I could document their true nature, I could replace that fear with knowledge." She gestured weakly to the sketchbook on the ground, its pages filled with her frantic drawings. "My intention was not to steal your secrets, but to understand them, so that one day, our peoples might not see each other as monsters." A tense silence followed her confession. The risk was immense. She had just admitted to deliberately violating their most sacred space, and her justification could easily be heard as arrogant, as if her people's ignorance was their problem to solve. Anya's stern expression did not change, but her eyes, those ancient, piercing eyes, narrowed thoughtfully. The flicker that passed through them was too swift to name, but it was not the pure, cold anger Elara expected. It was something more complex, something that looked almost like a reluctant and deeply buried curiosity. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, after Elara's confession. Anya's gaze was a physical weight, measuring the truth in her words against generations of suspicion. Then, the clan leader spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your words are bold, chronicler, but words are the easiest truth to forge. You wish to understand our ways, not as a thief in the shadows, but as a student. Then you will learn not by watching, but by doing. You will submit to a trial of intent." A ripple of disbelief moved through the clan's people. Elara's blood ran cold. A trial. This was not the punishment she had feared, but something far more perilous. She was being offered a chance that felt like a beautifully crafted trap. Anya gestured to the sacred circle where the shadows had danced moments before. "You will join the weaving. A simple pattern only, a child's first lesson. Perform it with respect, and you will have proven your purpose is more than mere curiosity. Fail, and you confirm you are a profane spy, unfit to even bear witness." The stakes were terrifyingly clear. To fail was to validate every dark story her people told, to shatter any hope of future dialogue. To step into that circle was to place herself, a child of the sun, at the mercy of an art form born of the deep night. Every instinct told her to refuse, to declare it an impossible demand. But she looked at Anya, at the unyielding challenge in her eyes, and saw that this was the only path forward. It was a test not of her skill, but of her heart. With a slow, deliberate nod that felt like signing her own exile, Elara accepted. She stepped forward, her legs feeling like water, and crossed the invisible boundary into the circle. Dozens of skeptical eyes tracked her every movement, their silent judgment a wall she had to breach. She was utterly, completely unprepared. She had spent her life studying the properties of light, of refraction, and lenses. This was its absolute opposite. Anya produced a smooth, dark river stone, its surface not shiny but deeply matte, as if it swallowed the very air around it. She placed it in Elara's trembling palm. The stone was shockingly cool, and its touch felt unnerving, a tiny void against her skin. "This is your focus," Anya instructed. The shadow does not answer to force. It answers to silence, to emptiness. You must still the sun inside you, child. You must invite the dark, not command it. Elara stared at the stone, her mind racing. How could she still the frantic thrum of her own fear? How could she empty a mind filled with a lifetime of warnings? She closed her eyes, shutting out the watching crowd, and reached for the only tool she had, her chronicler's memory. She recalled the exact rhythm of the chant, the way the clanspeople had held their bodies, loose and receptive. She remembered the feeling of the shadow tendril against the log, not aggressive, but inquisitive. The fundamental principles are universal, she told herself. Light reveals, but shadow defines. One cannot exist without the other. She was not here to conquer the darkness, but to acknowledge it, to ask for its participation. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she opened her eyes and focused entirely on the cold, absorbent stone in her hand, trying to pour her intent into its quiet depths, hoping against hope that the shadows could feel respect as clearly as they could feel fear. The air grew thick with silent judgment as Elara raised her hands, mimicking the fluid gestures she had so carefully observed. Anya's instructions were sparse, each word a drop of ice water. Draw from the stillness, not the space, but her hands felt clumsy, her movements sharp and desperate where they needed to be soft and receptive. She tried to pull a thread of shadow from the air, but all she produced were faint, dissipating wisps that vanished like breath on a cold morning. A low murmur of disapproval rippled through the watching clanspeople, a sound that felt heavier than any shout. Her confidence, already a fragile thing, began to shatter. Every instinct born under the sun-drenched canopy screamed at her to reject this. Her people's entire philosophy was built on pushing back the dark, on filling every corner with light and clarity. To invite shadow felt like a betrayal of her very nature, like trying to breathe water instead of air. Her muscles tensed, fighting against a lifetime of conditioning. She was trying to command the darkness, and it was refusing her. Panic clawed at her throat. This was her single chance, and she was failing. The clan's stoic faces were hardening into final, grim verdicts. In that moment of impending collapse, she made a choice. She stopped. She closed her eyes, shutting out the skeptical gazes, the weight of her failure. She forced her breathing to slow and reached for a different memory, not of fear, but of profound harmony. She recalled the perfect synchronicity of the ritual, the way the clanspeople moved not as masters of the shadow, but as its partners. They did not force, they invited, they offered an emptiness for the dark to fill. She let the tension drain from her shoulders, her hands going limp and open. She stopped trying to pull and instead simply offered a space, a silent, willing void in the palm of her intent. It was a surrender, not to the clan, but to the principle itself. And in that moment of quiet acceptance, something shifted. A cool, smooth sensation brushed against her fingertips. Her eyes snapped open. To her utter astonishment, a single ribbon of solid, tangible darkness, obedient and calm, was coiling slowly around her fingers, answering not her force, but her respect. A collective sharp intake of breath, echoed through the clearing. The single, perfect ribbon of shadow coiled around Elara's fingers, a stark, impossible contrast against her sun-warmed skin. The silence that followed was no longer hostile, but stunned. The rigid suspicion in the clanspeople's postures seemed to soften, their guarded expressions giving way to a quiet, profound astonishment. They were not looking at a spy anymore. They were looking at a question mark, a paradox that challenged the very foundation of their world. Anya, the stern leader, studied the woven thread of darkness for a long moment, her obsidian-like face betraying the faintest flicker of something that might have been respect. She gave a single, slow, measured nod. It was not a welcome, but an acknowledgement. The trial was over, and she had passed. The relief that washed over Elara was immediately followed by a new, heavier pressure. She was no longer fighting for her life, but for her credibility. The weight of their changed perception settled on her shoulders, a burden of expectation far greater than mere survival. They now expected her to understand, and she felt terrifyingly out of her depth. In that moment, instinct guided her. With the same deliberate slowness she had used to create it, she extended her hand toward Anya, offering the woven shadow back to its rightful master. It was a gesture of profound respect among her own people, the act of a guest returning a sacred object. She was showing them that she understood this was not her art to claim, but a privilege they had granted. Anya's gaze deepened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing Elara's as she accepted the offering. The shadow thread did not snap or fade. It seemed to melt into her palm, absorbed back into the greater darkness from which it came. The simple, elegant act completed a circuit of mutual understanding. "You have passed the first gate," Anya said, her voice still low, but the stone grinding edge was gone. "You may remain, you may observe the heart of the ceremony, but remember, chronicler, to witness is to share a burden. What you see now cannot be unseen." The stakes had irrevocably shifted. Her personal quest was now intertwined with the fragile trust of an entire clan. She was being offered a glimpse into their soul, and with that offer came a responsibility that chilled her to the bone. One misinterpreted sketch, one careless word carried back to her people, could destroy everything. Anya turned, and the clanspeople, their astonishment now tempered with a wary curiosity, parted to make a space for her at the edge of the sacred circle. The low, resonant chanting began again, but this time, Elara was not a hidden observer. She was an acknowledged guest, standing at the precipice of a mystery far deeper than she had ever dared to imagine. The air itself seemed to change as the chanting swelled, no longer a low thrum, but a complex, layered harmony that resonated in Elara's bones. She sat at the very edge of the circle, her sketchbook lying forgotten in her lap. To try and capture this with charcoal would be like trying to cage a thunderstorm in a glass jar. The clanspeople began to move, their dance a language of pure geometry and intention. Their hands did not clutch or grasp at the darkness. Instead, they guided it, their flowing gestures pulling long, silken ribbons of shadow from the air, weaving them into an intricate lattice overhead. It was not a demonstration of power, but of profound cooperation. Each individual's movement was essential, a single thread in a communal tapestry, as a vast, protective dome of woven night began to arch over the entire clearing. This was the true purpose she had risked everything to find. It was not a weapon. It was a shield, a communal defense forged from the very substance of their world. The terrifying shadow beasts of her people's fireside tales dissolved before her eyes, replaced by this breathtakingly beautiful, functional architecture of darkness. Her mind reeled, trying to force this new reality into the old, fear-shaped box of her upbringing. How could something so harmonious, so clearly born of unity and respect, be twisted into a story of sinister magic? The conflict was a quiet earthquake inside her, crumbling the walls of prejudice she hadn't even known were there. She made a conscious decision then, closing the cover of her sketchbook. Some truths were too vast, too deeply felt to be pinned to a page. They had to be absorbed, to settle in the soul. She let the rhythm of the chant and the fluid grace of the dancers wash over her, committing the feeling of it to memory. The cool, protective embrace of the dome, the palpable sense of shared purpose, the silent language of hands and shadows working as one. In that moment, she was no longer a chronicler gathering foreign data. She was a student, humbled and receptive, being given a lesson that would redefine her understanding of the world. As the final threads of shadow were woven into place, sealing the dome, a profound silence fell. Then, from the center of the circle, a soft, internal light began to bloom. It was not the harsh glare of the sun, but a gentle, phosphorescent radiance that seemed to emanate from the clanspeople themselves, from moss-covered stones, from the very air. It illuminated their faces, and for the first time, Elara saw not painted warriors, but a community at peace, their expressions filled with a quiet, collective accomplishment. They were safe, they were whole, and she was witnessing the most intimate moment of their lives. The final threads of shadow settled into the dome, and the gentle, internal light illuminated Anya's face as she approached. The ritual was complete, but a new, more personal trial was beginning. Anya stopped before Elara, her stern expression softened by the ceremony's afterglow. "You have witnessed the weaving of our shield," she said, her voice low and measured. "Now you will break bread with the weavers. You are invited to our feast." It was not a warm welcome, but a formal, deliberate offer of truce. As if to seal the invitation, the great shadow wolf, Umbra, padded silently forward and settled at Elara's feet, resting his massive head on his paws. His luminous eyes, once a threat, now watched her with a calm that felt like a shield in itself. The clanspeople watched this silent endorsement, and the last vestiges of open hostility in their postures seemed to dissolve into a wary, watchful curiosity. Elara's acceptance was a single, gracious nod. "Thank you, the honor is mine," but her mind was racing. The controlled, sacred space of the ritual was one thing. A social gathering, with its unpredictable currents of conversation and custom, was another entirely. Her mission's success now pivoted from understanding their magic to understanding their hearts. One clumsy gesture, one accidental breach of etiquette, could shatter the fragile trust she had just earned. She resolved to become a vessel, to listen with every fiber of her being, and speak only when necessary. This was no longer about documenting what they did, but about learning who they were. She was ushered from the sacred clearing to a smaller, sheltered grove, where low stone tables were arranged in a circle. The air was rich with the scent of roasting tubers and strange, aromatic herbs. Clanspeople moved with a relaxed grace now, their ceremonial intensity replaced by a soft hum of conversation. Elara found a place indicated to her, and as she sat, a young woman with kind eyes and hair braided with dark feathers, placed a warm, hand-thrown clay cup before her. Steam, carrying a scent both floral and deeply earthy, rose from the dark liquid within. It was tea, made from flowers that bloomed only for the moon, its fragrance an echo of the forest itself, alien, yet somehow comforting. She wrapped her hands around the cup, the heat a grounding anchor in a sea of the unfamiliar. This simple act of sharing a drink felt more significant than any ritual. It was a test of her empathy, her willingness to accept not just their power, but their hospitality. The fate of her hope for understanding now rested on her ability to navigate this simple, fragrant cup of tea. The warmth of the teacup was a small sun in her hands, a stark contrast to the night air and the quiet intensity of the faces around the low fire. As the last of the meal was finished, an elder with a voice like rustling leaves began to speak. He did not tell a story of power or magic, but of flight. He spoke of a time long past, when his people were driven from the sunlit groves by tribes wielding spears of blinding light, forced to seek refuge in the deep woods where the very darkness became their only sanctuary and their greatest ally. Their mastery of shadow was not born of a desire for dominion, but from the desperate, generations-long need to hide, to protect, to survive against those who saw their difference as a threat. Elara listened, her chronicler's mind piecing together a history she had never been taught. The fearsome Shadow Glade clan, in their own memory, were refugees. The realization was a cold stone in her stomach. Her people, the Canopy Folk, were descendants of those light-wielding tribes. The comfortable narrative of her own civilization was suddenly inverted, and she felt the weight of an ancestral guilt she had never asked for, but could not deny. The bridge of shared narrative they were building felt fragile, built over a chasm of old pain. When the elder finished, the expectant silence turned to her. This was the moment. She could offer a safe, simple tale, or she could be brave. She drew a slow breath, the scent of wood smoke and night-blooming flowers filling her lungs. I will share with you the story my people tell of the first sunrise, she began, her voice soft but clear. She spoke of a world of endless, formless gray, and of a single, courageous bird who flew to the edge of the world to plead with the spirits for a tool to define the shapes of things, to bring warmth and color. The spirit gifted the bird with a single, burning ember, which it carried back in its beak, though the heat scarred it forever. That ember became the sun, and its light revealed the world for the first time. But she added, her gaze sweeping the circle, my people's telling ends there. They speak only of the glory of the light. They never speak of what was lost when the shadows fled. They never speak of you. A profound silence followed her words. She had not just shared a story, she had acknowledged its incompleteness. She had openly admitted that her people's foundational myth was one of conquest, not just creation. I am sorry, she said, the words feeling both terrifyingly inadequate and profoundly necessary. I am sorry for the fear that has lived between us for so long. I cannot change the past, but I wish for a future where our stories are not weapons, but gifts we exchange. The air in the grove was thick with unspoken history. The academic observer was gone, replaced by a young woman grappling with the sins of her fathers, her hope for peace feeling desperately fragile. Anya, who had been listening with her inscrutable calm, looked thoughtfully into the dancing flames of the fire. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice low and resonant. Your words are a curious echo, chronicler. They remind me of an old prophecy, one many of us considered a forgotten dream. It speaks of a bridge walker, one who would come from the realm of the searing light, not to conquer, but to understand. One who would carry the dawn in one hand and the respect for the night in the other, and in doing so, would mend a tear in the world. A prophecy, the word hung in the firelit air, immense and terrifying. All eyes were upon Elara, a mixture of ancient hope and fresh skepticism, pressing down on her, a weight far heavier than any pack or book. The idea was absurd, a pressure she could not possibly bear. She was a scholar, a seeker of facts, not some mythical bridge walker from an old clan dream. The expectation in their gazes felt like a cage being built around her. "I am no one from a prophecy," she said, her voice firm but respectful, cutting through the silence. "I am only a chronicler. I came here with a sketchbook and a question, not a destiny, but I can carry a truth. I can return to my people and show them that the stories we tell about you are wrong. I can document your history as you have shared it with me, and I can speak of this night not as a trespass, but as an honor." Her mission was reforging itself in the heat of that moment. It was no longer a personal quest for knowledge, but a public duty to correct a generational lie. She would use her skills not to fulfill a prophecy, but to build a foundation of simple, verifiable fact upon which a future understanding might stand. The fate of two civilizations, which had felt like an abstract concept, now rested squarely on her shoulders, on her ability to translate this profound, lived experience into a story her own people would believe. As she made this quiet vow, the first sliver of gray dawn pierced the canopy. In response, the vast protective dome of woven shadow above them began to soften at its edges. The solid, tangible darkness became translucent, then ethereal, its threads unraveling with a gentle sigh as the growing light absorbed them back into the world. It was a silent, beautiful dissolution, a reminder that the night was not conquered, but respectfully yielded to the day. Dawn painted the world in shades of gray and gold, and with the light, the time for parting arrived. Anya stood before Elara, her expression unreadable once more, but her hands were not empty. She held out a small, polished shard of obsidian, its surface so deep and flawless, it seemed to be a piece of the night sky given solid form. "This is a shadow lens," Anya said, her voice low. "It is a tool for a chronicler who seeks more than surfaces. Do not look at it and see only the absence of light. Look through it, and you will see the essence of darkness itself, its structure, its purpose, its quiet life." The small stone was cool and surprisingly heavy in Elara's palm, a tangible weight of trust that felt far greater than its size. This was not a mere token. It was a key to a deeper understanding, a physical piece of their truth that she was now responsible for carrying into the world of light. Her heart clenched with a sudden, sharp fear. How would her people, who polished lenses to capture and magnify every stray sunbeam, react to a tool designed to reveal the secrets of shadow? They would see a weapon, a corrupting influence, a thing of inherent danger. Accepting this gift meant accepting the monumental task of translating its purpose, of defending its existence, before she even uttered a word about the ritual or the feast. The risk was immense, but to refuse it would be a betrayal of the trust so carefully built. She met Anya's gaze and bowed her head, closing her fingers carefully around the obsidian shard. "I accept this with gratitude," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise it will be treated with the respect it deserves." The stakes of her return had just been magnified 100-fold. She was no longer just carrying sketches and stories in her book, but a challenge to her civilization's most fundamental beliefs, held in the palm of her hand. As if sensing the solemnity of the moment, Umbra rose from his resting place and padded to her side. The journey back through the Whispering Woods was a reverse echo of her terrified arrival. This time, she walked openly, the massive wolf, a silent guardian at her flank. The hidden trails no longer felt like a maze of threats, but like familiar paths. The forest itself seemed to recognize her, its shadows feeling less like a prison and more like a protective cloak. When the familiar, sun-drenched border came into view, Umbra stopped. He let out a soft, rumbling chuff, then turned and melted back into the trees without a backward glance. Elara stood alone at the edge of two worlds, the weight of the shadow lens a constant, cool pressure against her skin, a silent question waiting for an answer. The familiar scent of sun-warmed bark and sweet blossom should have been a comfort, but as Elara stepped back into the dappled light of the Canopy Folk, it felt alien and thin. The night's profound silence still echoed in her bones, a stark contrast to the sudden, sharp rustle of leaves and the swift, organized descent of figures from the high branches. Her heart sank. It was a formal search party, led by Elder Kale himself, his face a rigid mask of relief, swiftly hardening into stern disapproval. The night's magic evaporated, replaced by the cold weight of judgment. Kale's gaze swept over her, taking in her disheveled state, the faint scent of night-blooming flowers and wood smoke that clung to her cloak. "You are unharmed," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. A statement, not a question. "We feared the shadows had consumed you." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. In that single, breathless moment, standing before the weathered faces of her people, Elara faced her first true test. To tell them everything, to speak of the woven shield and the shared feast, would be to shatter their reality too abruptly. Their fear was a wall, and the truth was a battering ram that would only make them build it higher. Her mind, still humming with the memory of Anya's voice and the cool weight of the lens in her pocket, made a tactical retreat. "I was safe," she said, her voice calm and clear, a practiced chronicler's tone. "I observed. I have learned things, Elder Kale, not of danger, but of a people whose story we have never understood, things that could benefit us all." It was a careful, calculated truth. She offered them a promise of useful knowledge, a hook of practical value, while withholding the heart of the matter, the gift and the prophecy that felt too fragile, too sacred to expose to such immediate skepticism. Kale's eyes narrowed, searching her face for a lie. "Your recklessness has caused great concern, Elara. Your observations will be presented to the full Elder Council at dusk. Until then, you will remain in your quarters." It was not a request. It was house arrest. Her credibility and her very freedom were now the price of admission for the story she had to tell. Being labeled a liar, or worse, a sympathizer corrupted by the dark, would mean more than just ostracization. It would mean the end of her chronicler's work, the end of any chance to build the bridge she now knew was possible. as two junior wardens fell into step beside her, guiding her not as a returned daughter, but as a potential contaminant. The small, cool weight of the shadow lens in her pocket felt less like a key and more like a countdown, ticking silently toward the coming confrontation. The heavy scent of ancient cedar filled the council chamber, a familiar aroma that now felt stifling. Elara stood in the center of the circular room, the sketches from her book laid out on the low stone table before the gathered elders. She did not speak of monsters or magic. She spoke of architecture, of a communal shield woven from shadow, a protective dome born of unity and respect. She described the feast, the shared stories, the history of a people who saw themselves not as conquerors, but as refugees. Her voice was steady, her account meticulously detailed, but a new passion underscored her chronicler's precision. She was not just reporting facts, she was advocating for a truth. The elders listened, their faces a gallery of stern masks, but as her narrative unfolded, the masks began to crack. Some elders leaned back, their eyes wide with a disturbance that was not fear of the Shadow Glade, but fear of her. They heard the shift in her perspective, the empathy in her descriptions, and it alarmed them more than any tale of shadow beasts ever could. This was not the objective report they had expected. It was a conversion. A heated debate erupted, shattering the chamber's formal silence. The traditionalists, their voices sharp, declared her corrupted, her mind twisted by shadow sorcery. How could a shield be woven from darkness unless it was a deception, a trick to lower their guard? A smaller faction, their voices cautious but clear, saw a strategic opportunity. If the Shadow Glade's power was truly defensive, then a dialogue could bring an end to generations of border tension and fear. The argument swirled around her, a storm of old fears clashing with new possibilities. Elara stood silent within the tumult. The cool weight of the obsidian shard a secret against her skin. She knew then that words and sketches were not enough. They needed to see. They needed to feel the truth she had held in her own hands. With a slow, deliberate motion that silenced the room, she reached into her pocket and placed the shadow lens upon the stone table. The polished obsidian was a pool of absolute night against the pale stone, a physical piece of the world they feared. This single act of defiance pushed the conflict into the open, transforming an abstract debate into a tangible, immediate confrontation. The chamber fell utterly silent, all eyes fixed on the small, dark object. After a long, tense moment, High Elder Kalen, his face an unreadable mask of weathered patience, reached out and picked up the lens. He did not recoil. He held it, his fingers curling around its cool surface, and slowly raised it to his eye, gazing into its impossible depths. The silence in the council chamber stretched, thin and brittle as old ice. High Elder Kalen did not move, his hand steady as he held the polished obsidian to his eye. He had expected a void, an emptiness to match the stories. Instead, he saw life, a complex, flowing tapestry of deep blues and violets, a lattice of energy woven with impossible precision, each thread humming with a quiet, purposeful vitality. This was not the absence of light. It was the presence of something else entirely, a beautiful, structured reality that had existed just beyond the edge of his perception his entire life. The foundations of his world, built over 7 decades, shuddered and cracked. He lowered the lens, his aged face a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. The rigid duty to his people's traditions warred violently with the undeniable truth his own eye had just witnessed. How many generations had lived in fear of a phantom? How many of their own laws were built upon a fundamental error? The weight of that possibility was a crushing physical pressure in his chest. His voice, when it finally came, was low and heavy, each word measured and deliberate. The chronicler's account is troubling, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the other elders. It challenges everything we hold as fact. Yet this artifact presents evidence that cannot be dismissed as sorcery or delusion. I see not corruption here, but a form of order we have failed to comprehend. Therefore, I decree a temporary truce with the Shadow Glade clan. We will suspend all patrols along the Whispering Woods border for one full cycle of the moon. This is not a surrender, but a period of study. We will seek to understand what this is before we decide what it means. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. It was the most radical order given in living memory. The political stakes were now terrifyingly real. For the Canopy Folk, this truce was a leap of faith that could either unveil a new ally or leave them vulnerable to an ancient enemy they had just admitted they did not understand. For the Shadow Glade, any misinterpretation of this gesture, any single aggressive move by a hot-headed Sun Clan youth, could be seen as a breach of trust, shattering the fragile peace before it even began. The path to war had never been narrower. Kaelin's eyes then found Elara, standing alone in the center of the room. "And you, chronicler," he said, his tone shifting from declaration to sober appointment. "You have walked this bridge where no other dared. You will serve as our liaison. You will carry our offer of truce and lead this study." The title was a monumental honor, a validation of everything she had risked. Yet it settled on her shoulders not as a crown, but as a yoke of immense responsibility. She was now the sole thread, connecting two worlds poised on a knife's edge, and the weight of that knowledge filled her with a cold, quiet terror. Twilight painted the border in shades of deep blue and lingering gold, a fragile space between two worlds. Elara stood at the head of a small delegation of Canopy Folk, their postures rigid, their hands resting a little too close to the tools at their belts. Across the clearing, Anya and a group of Shadow Glade clansmen emerged from the tree line, their dark painted faces impassive, their forms seeming to drink the fading light. The air was thick and heavy, not with the evening damp, but with the accumulated weight of centuries of suspicion. Every rustle of a cloak, every guarded glance, echoed with the memory of old wars and deeper fears. Elara stood precisely in the center, the sole point of contact in a silent, staring contest between two proud and wounded civilizations. Her role as liaison felt less like an honor and more like trying to hold two opposing magnets from snapping together. The first words spoken here would reverberate for generations, and the wrong one could shatter everything. She saw the tension in Elder Kael's jaw, the subtle, defensive shift in Anya's stance. They were not just leaders, they were living embodiments of their people's history, and that history was a wall between them. A formal greeting, a rehearsed speech about peace, would ring hollow against such deep-seated mistrust. They needed a shared experience, not a political dialogue. Her gaze swept from the last sliver of the sun to the deepening twilight, and an idea, simple and profound, took root. Instead of speaking of peace, she invited them to simply watch. She suggested they all observe the sunset together, a celestial event that belonged wholly to neither day nor night, but was the sacred domain of both. It was a neutral ground in the sky itself. A tense silence followed her suggestion, but then a slow, almost imperceptible nod from Anya, a grudging, wary grunt of agreement from Elder Kale. It was a start. As the sun's final brilliant edge vanished below the horizon, a remarkable transformation began. The long, stark shadows cast by the Canopy Folk, sharp and defined by the dying light, began to soften at their edges. Simultaneously, the first subtle threads of shadow, summoned by the clansmen, lifted from the forest floor. Instead of repelling each other, the two darknesses seemed to recognize a kindred nature. The hard lines of the sun's shadows blurred, gently intertwining with the fluid, woven threads of the Glade clan's art, creating a single, beautiful, hybrid pattern on the mossy ground. It was an unspoken, undeniable truth, written in fleeting silhouette upon the earth. A profound silence fell, the kind that follows a miracle. On the mossy ground between the two groups, the light and shadow had woven themselves into a single, breathtaking tapestry. The hard lines of the sun's retreat had softened, their final shadows embracing the first summoned threads of the Glade's art, creating a pattern more intricate and harmonious than either side could have made alone. It was a silent, undeniable truth written upon the earth, and it stunned both delegations into a shared, breathless wonder. The rigid formality that had held them apart shattered, replaced not by words, but by a palpable sense of awe at the possibility they were witnessing. Elara held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the precipice. One cynical word, one fearful flinch, and this fragile moment of beauty would dissolve back into the old suspicions. The air itself seemed to wait. Then Anya stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and resonant, carrying the cool stillness of the deep woods. She offered a traditional Glade blessing, not for her own people, but for the coming night that would now shelter them all. It was a gesture of profound significance, an offering of their most sacred trust. All eyes shifted to Elder Kalen. His face was a landscape of internal conflict, the weight of a lifetime of caution warring with the evidence before his eyes. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then he inclined his head. His voice, usually so firm and commanding, was softer as he offered in return the ancient Canopy Folk blessing for the departed day, a prayer of gratitude for the light that had revealed the world. It was not merely a reciprocation, it was a recognition. Two invocations, once seen as opposing forces, now hung together in the twilight air, completing a sacred circle. A foundation of mutual respect had been laid, stone by careful stone, but everyone present could feel its fragility. It was a bridge made of spider silk, beautiful and strong in concept, but vulnerable to the slightest jarring step. Its maintenance would demand constant, conscious effort from everyone. Yet, from that delicate beginning, a first, tangible plan emerged. Tentative words were exchanged, and an agreement was reached to begin a cultural exchange. The Canopy Folk would host the first gathering, a demonstration of their own sacred rites with the coming dawn. The invitation was extended, and for the first time in living memory, it was accepted. The air was cool and expectant as the Shadow Glade delegation stood at the edge of the Canopy Folk's sacred grove. Elara stood beside Elder Kalen, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. The sky above the eastern treetops began to pale from deep indigo to a soft, hopeful gray. This was the moment of truth. At Kalen's quiet signal, the Canopy artisans moved. They did not raise weapons, but polished lenses and flawless mirrors, angling them with a reverence that was palpable. As the sun's first brilliant sliver crested the horizon, they caught its light. A collective sharp intake of breath came from the Glade clansmen. A single, searing beam of pure white light was captured, then split, then woven by the artisan's steady hands into a complex, shimmering lattice overhead. It was not a harsh glare, but a living canopy of gold and amber, a tapestry of warmth that settled over the grove. The light did not burn or destroy. It coaxed. Beneath its gentle radiance, the grove itself seemed to awaken. Flowers tilted their faces upward, their petals unfurling with visible speed. The very air grew warmer, humming with a vibrant energy that felt like the first breath of spring. This was the truth Elara had tried to convey. The light was not a spear, but a source. It was life and art, a communal creation that mirrored the Glade's own shield of woven shadow in its purpose and its beauty. Yet old fears have deep roots. When a particularly brilliant knot of light flared directly above, several of the Glade clansmen instinctively recoiled, their hands coming up to shield their eyes, their bodies tensing as if for a blow. It was a visceral, unthinking reaction, a ghost of ancient battles haunting the present moment. The fragile trust of the dawn trembled. Elara did not hesitate. She stepped into the space between the two groups, her voice calm and clear, translating the ceremony in real time. She did not just name the tools, she explained their intent. See how they guide the light, never forcing it, she said, her gaze sweeping from the flinching clansmen to the focused artisans. That crystal is not to amplify power, but to soften the sun's raw edge into a warmth that can nurture. This weaving is their prayer for the day, a plea for growth and clarity. She was building a bridge of understanding, word by careful word, showing the Shadow Folk, the soul behind the sun's brilliance. With every passing moment, as the Glade delegation witnessed the grove thriving under the luminous canopy, their defensive postures softened. The initial fear in their eyes was slowly replaced by a dawning, profound respect. They were seeing their own reflection in a different medium. This shared recognition was the true victory, and it made the possibility of peace feel terrifyingly real. For peace would demand change, and change is a threat to those who find safety in the old, familiar divisions. As the light weaving reached its zenith, Anya stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting the golden canopy above. Her voice, when she spoke, was thoughtful. "We have seen how your light defines and nurtures," she said to Elder Kalen, "and you have witnessed how our shadow protects and contains. They are two halves of a single breath. Perhaps it is time we learn to breathe together." She then offered a proposal, a single, beautiful idea that could make their truce permanent. "Let us create a garden that belongs to neither day nor night, but exists in the balance of perpetual twilight, a place where your light weaving and our shadow weaving can collaborate, nurturing something new, something that could not exist without both our arts." The clearing they chose was a scar on the land, a place where an ancient storm had felled a great tree, leaving a gash of open sky. It was perfect, belonging to no one and everyone. The work began with a quiet, determined energy. Canopy Folk artisans, their hands accustomed to polishing lenses, now hauled smooth, light-reflecting stones into careful patterns, while the Shadow Glade weavers coaxed strange, shade-loving mosses and creeping vines from the fertile soil. It was a physical dialogue, a language of labor where every placed stone and every nurtured plant was a word in a new, shared vocabulary. The garden began to take shape not as a canopy sun trap or a glade shadow sanctum, but as something entirely new, a place of dappled, perpetual twilight. This living, growing testament was their answer to centuries of fear, a fragile hope made visible. But hope is a delicate seed, and it soon met the rocky soil of old habits. A disagreement flared over the placement of a central reflecting pool. The canopy artisans insisted it needed maximum exposure to the midday sun to properly catch the light, while the glade weavers argued it would disrupt the flow of shadow needed for their bioluminescent fungi to thrive. The debate grew heated, the technical terms of one side sounding like arrogant demands to the other. The garden's future, once a beautiful dream, suddenly felt like a blueprint for failure. Elara moved between the two groups, her voice a calm counterpoint to the rising frustration. She did not take sides. Instead, she asked questions, forcing each side to articulate not just what they wanted, but why. She reminded the light weavers that the pool was not just a mirror, but also water, a life-giving element that belonged to the whole forest. She asked the shadow weavers if the fungi could not learn to drink from the reflected light as well as the deep dark. She was not a leader giving orders, but a translator helping two different languages find a common meaning. Her intervention was a subtle but crucial test of their commitment. Would they cling to their isolated perfection, or were they willing to create something imperfect, but shared? Slowly, grudgingly, a compromise was sketched in the dirt. The pool would be offset, catching the softer light of the morning and late afternoon, and special, more resilient fungal strains would be cultivated along its shaded edges. The success of this single garden had become a public symbol, its progress watched by every creature in the forest. Birds from the canopy reported back to their elders, and the rustling leaves carried news to the deep woods. Its failure would not be a simple project abandoned. It would be a verdict, proof that their ancient differences were too profound to overcome. This shared pressure forged a reluctant unity, a determination to see the thing through. And then, one morning, when the mist still clung to the new leaves, they found it, nestled between a light warmed stone and the soft embrace of a shadow weaver's moss. A single bud had opened. It was a moon petal, a flower so rare it was considered a myth by both peoples. Its petals were the color of silver and milk, and they glowed with a soft, internal radiance that required neither the full sun nor the absolute dark, but thrived only in the precise, balanced light of dawn and dusk. It was the garden's first miracle, a silent, living affirmation that their difficult, beautiful collaboration was not just possible, but already beginning to bear fruit. That single moon petal, glowing with its own gentle light, became more than a flower. To the people of both tribes, it was a sign, a clear blessing from the forest itself on their fragile alliance. Its impossible beauty, thriving only in their shared creation, was a truth no argument could easily dismiss. The flower was quickly adopted as the official emblem of their unification, its image appearing on gateposts and woven into cloaks as a symbol of hope. This visible, living proof ignited a fire of popular support among the common folk. Canopy farmers, tired of guarding their borders in fear, and glade hunters, weary of a life spent in hiding, began to openly champion the new peace. Their collective voice grew into a steady, public pressure that the remaining traditionalist leaders could no longer ignore. Yet, as the light of hope grew brighter, it cast a deeper, more defiant shadow. A faction of hardline Canopy Folk, led by a charismatic and stern elder named Borin, saw not a blessing but a corruption. He began to speak in the crowded gathering halls, his voice ringing with old, powerful fears. He called the alliance a betrayal of their ancestors, a dangerous folly that would allow the shadows to consume them from within. The conflict had shifted from a quiet disagreement among elders to an open, political schism that threatened to tear the Canopy Folk community in two. In the face of this rising storm, Elara and Anya made a crucial decision. They would not hide or negotiate in secret. They would stand together in the heart of their shared garden and present a united front to all. The sight of the young chronicler and the stern Shadow Glade leader, side by side, speaking of a shared future, was a powerful, silent argument against Borin's warnings. Their joint speeches, delivered as the moon petal glowed softly beside them, drew large mixed crowds, a testament to the deep yearning for peace that Borin's fear could not entirely extinguish. But the stakes were now terrifyingly real. This was no longer a war of words over rituals, but a struggle for the very soul of a people. The political fracture deepened, and families found themselves divided, the old unity of the Canopy Folk shattered. In a dramatic escalation that chilled the newfound warmth in the grove, Borin and his followers made their move. They declared that at the next full moon, they would perform the ancient Great Cleansing Ritual, a ceremony not used for generations, meant to purge what they called the shadow taint from their lands once and for all. The Great Cleansing was no longer a whispered threat, but a physical reality. Borin's followers worked with grim efficiency, hauling massive, flawless light-focusing crystals to a high platform in the canopy. Their intent was terrifyingly simple. They planned to channel the full, untamed fury of the midday sun into a single, scorching beam, a lance of pure energy meant to burn the Twilight Garden from the earth and scar the borderlands into a permanent wasteland. Such an act would not just be destruction, it would be a declaration of war, an unforgivable violation that would shatter the truce for 1,000 generations. The fragile peace, so carefully nurtured, now hung by a thread over an abyss. Across the border, the Shadow Glade clansmen did not flee. They stood their ground, their own protective weavings of shadow growing denser and more complex. A silent, grim preparation for an attack they now saw as inevitable. The air in the forest grew thick with the scent of impending violence. Elara felt the conflict tear at her very soul. Her loyalty to the Canopy Folk, the people who had raised her, warred violently with her duty to the alliance she had forged with her own hands and the friends she had made in the shadows. To stand with one was to betray the other, but in that impossible choice, she found her path. She would not raise a weapon or summon a shadow. She would wield the only tool that had ever truly worked between their peoples, the truth. She would confront Borin directly, armed not with force, but with the evidence she had gathered and the future she had seen with her own eyes. The survival of the garden, the safety of Anya and her clan, the very hope for a different world, all rested on this single, desperate appeal to reason. She found him at the Sunspire, the highest point in the canopy, where the air was thin and the light was brutally clear. He stood before the largest crystal, a monolith of polished quartz, his hands adjusting its final alignment as the sun climbed toward its zenith. The air was thin and sharp at the summit of the Sunspire. Elara stepped into the blinding glare, the heat from the massive crystal, a physical force against her skin. Boren stood with his back to her, his hands making final, precise adjustments to the quartz monolith. She did not shout or plead. She simply placed herself directly in the beam's intended path, her small frame a shield against the coming annihilation. He turned, his face a mask of furious disbelief. You would stand against your own people for these creatures of the void. His voice was a low growl, tight with conviction. She did not answer with an argument. Instead, she raised the shadow lens, its polished obsidian surface, a pocket of perfect night in the searing light. Look, Boren, before you destroy, for one moment. Simply look. She thrust the lens toward him. See what I have seen. With a snarl of contempt, he snatched it, expecting a trick, a blinding darkness. He pressed it to his eye, ready to denounce the illusion, and he froze, his breath caught. The rigid anger in his shoulders slackened, just for a second. He was not seeing an empty blackness. He was seeing the beautiful, humming lattice of deep blues and violets, the intricate, living energy of a shadow, a structure of profound and purposeful life. It was a vision of order, not chaos. His hand trembled, the lens lowered. For a single, heart-stopping moment, his dogma wavered, confronted by an undeniable, beautiful truth. Then his face hardened again, the old fear slamming back into place like a fortress gate. Sorcery, he hissed, his voice trembling with a different kind of fear now. A clever illusion to ensnare the mind. You are lost to us, chronicler, lost. He gestured sharply to his followers. Secure her. They moved forward, their hands reaching to grab her arms, to drag her from the platform. This was the moment she had feared, the moment of violent division, but she would not meet their force with force. As their hands closed in, she made her choice. With a final, desperate look at Boren, she took the precious shadow lens, the key to her understanding, the gift of a clan leader's trust, and dashed it onto the stone platform at their feet. The obsidian shattered with a sound like ice breaking, 1,000 glittering shards scattering in the sunlight. Truth does not need a lens to be seen, she declared, her voice ringing clear above the sudden silence. It only needs a mind willing to see. The sacrifice of her most treasured artifact was her final, purest argument, a plea that resonated not with magic, but with raw, unadorned conviction. The glittering fragments of obsidian lay between them like a broken star, and in that breathless, shattered silence, the first silver ray of the full moon crested the horizon, its cool light meeting the sun's dying fire on the spire. The moonlight washed over the spire, a cool, impartial tide of silver. It fell upon the great crystal, and in doing so, revealed the truth. A long, sharp-edged shadow stretched across the platform, a perfect, undeniable silhouette of the monolith itself. It was not a void or a stain, but an integral part of the object, a companion shape defined by the very light Boren sought to wield. He stared at that simple shadow, his gaze fixed on the evidence that had been before him every day of his life, yet which he had been taught to fear and reject. The intricate dogma, the generations of warnings, All crumbled before this elemental fact. Light could not exist without the shadow it cast. His shoulders slumped, the furious ambition draining from him like a poison. "Lower the crystal," he commanded, his voice hollow. "The cleansing will not proceed." A ripple of shocked confusion moved through his followers. The immediate crisis was averted, but the air still crackled with their deep-seated resentment. Their leader had surrendered to the very thing they had vowed to destroy. Boren turned to face them, his face a mask of weary clarity. "My understanding was flawed," he declared, his voice gaining strength from the admission. "I saw an enemy in a fundamental truth. I will submit myself to the judgment of the full Elder Council." This public concession was a seismic shift, but it did not instantly heal the fracture. The threat of violence was gone, yet the long, difficult work of mending hearts and minds had only just begun. Trust, once broken, is not rebuilt with a single act of contrition. Later that night, under the serene gaze of the full moon, a different kind of gathering took place. Representatives from both tribes converged on the Twilight Garden, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the moon petal and the gentle luminescence of the newly cultivated fungi. They stood not as adversaries, but as partners on neutral ground, ready to formally ratify the alliance that had been tested in fire. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and a palpable, fragile hope. In this sacred space, born of their collaboration, they would lay the foundation for a shared future, knowing that the true challenge of integration now lay ahead. The silence in the garden was profound, a held breath for the entire forest. Kaelin and Anya stepped forward, the elder of the sun and the leader of the shadows, their differences etched not just in their faces, but in the very air around them. They stood before the central moon petal, its soft glow a silent witness to their impossible journey. Then, in a movement that felt both ancient and entirely new, they placed their hands upon the flower, one weathered and sun-spotted, the other marked with the faint traces of dark ceremonial paint. Their voices, one clear as morning, the other deep as a root-filled earth, wove together into a single, solemn vow. They swore to govern the forest as one, to respect the sacred domains of both light and shadow, and to protect the delicate balance they had fought so hard to create. This was the Pact of the Balanced Wood, a new beginning forged from an old conflict, and in that pivotal moment, they turned to Elara. They named her the first keeper of the balance. The title settled upon her, a weight of honor and immense responsibility. She was no longer just a chronicler of the past, but a guardian of the future. Her life's work was now to document the ongoing story of this shared civilization, to ensure that the lessons of their hard-won peace would never be forgotten. She accepted, her own vow a quiet echo of theirs, a promise to use her skills not just for observation, but for preservation. The atmosphere was thick with the gravity of the moment. Every person present, from the most skeptical Canopy guard to the most reserved Glade weaver, understood the fragility of what they were building. This was not a victory celebration, but the assumption of a shared burden. The Pact was a beautiful dream, but its success would define the fate of the forest for centuries, and its failure would mean a return to a darkness deeper than any shadow. As the final words of the oath faded, something remarkable happened. The bioluminescent plants throughout the garden seemed to pulse, their gentle light glowing with a new, steadier intensity. The Canopy Folk's light crystals, scattered amongst the stones, responded in kind, humming with a softer, warmer radiance that no longer sought to overpower the dark, but to complement it. The garden itself was affirming their choice, the very elements of light and shadow harmonizing in a silent, hopeful chorus. The title of Keeper came with a practical, urgent responsibility. Elara immediately established a new order of chroniclers, the Bridge Walkers. These were not just record keepers, but future diplomats, individuals who would be deliberately trained in the languages, histories, and sacred arts of both the Canopy Folk and the Shadow Glade. Her argument was simple yet profound. Misunderstanding had nearly destroyed them, so a continuous, dedicated flow of accurate knowledge was their only permanent shield against the creeping return of fear. The first class was a nervous gathering of youths, their postures echoing the old divisions. A young canopy boy sat stiffly, his gaze carefully avoiding the dark painted girl from the glade, while she watched his every move with a quiet, simmering suspicion. The air in the new learning grove was thick with unspoken history. An accidental brush of shoulders was met with a flinch, a mispronounced word with a muffled scoff. These were not the open hostilities of their elders, but the quieter, more stubborn ghosts of inherited prejudice. Elara watched it all with a patient heart. She knew that laws and treaties could not force trust. It had to be cultivated, day by day, lesson by lesson. She made a foundational decision for the curriculum. The very first lesson for every new group of bridge walkers would not be held in a classroom or with a scroll. It would be a full day spent together, silently observing a sunrise from the canopy spires and a sunset from the edge of the Shadow Glade. They would not speak, they would not take notes. They would simply witness the world completing its breath, the brilliant, defining light giving way to the soft, protective dark. This shared, sensory experience, she believed, was the only true foundation for everything they would later learn. The future of the balanced wood, the stability of a peace bought with such struggle, now rested on the shoulders of these hesitant, skeptical children. Could they learn to see the world not as two opposing halves, but as a single, breathing entity? The answer would not be found in their words, but in their willingness to sit together in the quiet transition from day to night. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating session, where a light weaving exercise had fallen into disarray, she saw a breakthrough. A glade youth, struggling to soften a beam of sunlight, was silently guided by the canopy boy who had once flinched at her touch. He adjusted her hand, his own movements hesitant but kind. In return, she later showed him how to still his mind, a necessary skill for shadow weaving, by placing his palm on the cool bark of a twilight tree. They were not masters, but they were trying, and then she heard it. A burst of shared laughter as their next combined attempt produced not a perfect weave, but a charming, chaotic splash of dappled light and playful shadow that danced across the clearing. In that unscripted, joyful sound, Elara felt the heavy weight of her title finally lift, replaced by a profound and quiet fulfillment. The garden had been their first miracle, but this was their second, and it was far more resilient. Peace, it turned out, was not the absence of challenge, but a new way of facing it. The first true test of the balanced wood arrived not with a rival tribe, but from the sky itself. A strange, unseasonal gloom descended, a thick, magical haze that clung to the canopy for days, refusing to yield to the sun. It was a creeping, silent threat that starved the light-loving plants and frayed the nerves of both peoples. Panic, that old familiar enemy, began to whisper in the gathering shadows. The Canopy Folk fretted over their wilting groves, while the Shadow Glade clansmen felt a claustrophobic pressure, their protective weavings rendered inert by the pervasive, formless dark. The new pact felt fragile, a theory about to be shattered by a practical disaster. Elara knew this was the moment. If they could not stand together now, the alliance would crumble into dust. She called the elders and the newly trained bridge walkers to the heart of the Twilight garden. The air was heavy and still, the magical gloom muting the world to a dull gray. "We have spent seasons learning each other's arts," she said, her voice cutting through the anxious murmur. "We learned that light defines and shadow protects. Now we must learn that one can empower the other. This gloom is not a shadow, it is a void. It has no structure for our light to pierce, and no purpose for our shadows to guard against. We must create that structure together." Her plan was as daring as her first journey into the Whispering Woods. The Canopy Folk would gather every lens and crystal, focusing not just sunlight, but their collective hope into a single, concentrated beam of pure energy. But a beam of light, no matter how powerful, would simply scatter in this soupy haze. It needed a guide. It needed a path carved through the chaos, and that was the Shadow Glade's role. They would not fight the darkness, but master it. They would weave the ambient gloom itself, binding the formless murk into a defined, tubular channel, a conduit to give the light direction and purpose. It was a complete inversion of their ancient roles, a breathtaking synergy that had never before been attempted. The initial attempts were clumsy, even dangerous. A beam of canopy light, unleashed without its shadowy guide, refracting wildly and scorching a patch of sacred moss. A shadow glade weaving, created without the light's intent, collapsing in on itself and deepening the local darkness. The frustration was palpable, the old fears rising like ghosts. But the bridge walkers, the children of the new peace, moved between the struggling groups. They translated not just words, but intent. They showed the light weavers how to soften their focus, to make their energy receptive to guidance. They helped the shadow binders understand how to weave a channel that was not a barrier, but a welcome. Slowly, painstakingly, the two forces began to harmonize. Then it happened. A sustained, collective hum of focused light met the intricate, silent lattice of bound shadow. The beam of brilliant gold did not fight the dark conduit, but flowed into it, embraced by it. Together, they shot upward, a spear of structured brilliance, piercing the heart of the gloom. A collective gasp rose from the forest floor as a single, perfect circle of blue sky appeared directly overhead, a window to the world they had almost forgotten. The unified beam swept across the sky, the shadow weavers expertly steering the channel, the light weavers feeding it with unwavering energy. Like a divine needle and thread, they stitched the heavens back together, the oppressive gloom unraveling before their combined might. As the last of the haze dissolved, allowing the warm, full light of the sun to wash over the balanced wood, a profound silence fell, followed by an eruption of pure, shared joy. They had not just cleared the sky, they had proven their union was more than a promise. It was a power greater than the sum of its parts, a functional, living reality that could defend their world. The pact was no longer ink on a scroll, but a truth written in light and shadow across the heavens.